Okay, so you should have just looked at a picture, and you just sketched it. And the reason why I did this was more so to see if you could see what was really going on in that picture, which is basically, if you look in the little corner, you're going to see little Icarus in the middle of the water with his 2 feet up in the air, drowning, and everybody else doesn't seem to notice him. He's a very small figure, so if you need to pause it and look back at the picture, you can see him. I think he's in the small, the like right hand corner of the page in the water. But that is Icarus, and Icarus might sound familiar because Foster talked about him. And basically, the myth behind Icarus is he ended up trying to escape from a prison. Him and his father, I believe, were trapped in this prison, so he made a set of wings, or his father did, and they were out of wax and feathers. And what ended up happening is, as they were flying, the father said, "Son, you need to not go too high, because if you go too high, you're going to melt the wings of the flying device that is going to help them escape from prison." And sure enough, the son doesn't listen to his father, gets tempted by the, flights of fancy, as Foster would put it, flies too close to the sun, it melts the wings, he crashes into the water and dies. So that's the mythology behind it, and I mean, you guys could talk about obviously what that means. I think it's a practical lesson about you should respect your elders or follow the advice of your parents, but the fall of Icarus has sparked quite a bit of illusion. And what has happened is we see this picture, and then we have seen two poets who've written on this picture, thus showing us illusion. And that's kind of the focus today. I know we've talked about illusion here and there, but illusion is important for you guys to realize as a lit device. It could be something that you write about when you do AP analysis or when you're doing the AP essays. And also, Foster, I mean, really his entire book is one big ode to illusion, because he talks, there's nothing original, everything's borrowed from something else, and that's what illusion is borrowing from another piece of work, whether it be a short story, a poem, a statue, what have you. So what I'd like you guys to do right now is I want you guys, before you even start talking about the other two poems today for Icarus, I want to talk about the homework. You have a handout with you, and what I need you to do is I'd like you to look at it, because this is the directions for the homework, and this is the first graded assignment that's going into the grade book. Normally I wouldn't go into this much detail, but this is a graded project, and I want you guys to know my expectations. So you guys are going to read a poem by Sharon Olds called My Son the Man. When you read through it, you're going to obviously do what you always do, is annotate, pick apart structure and meaning. When you pick apart the structure, I'd like you to kind of hone in on 2, maybe 3 things that the author is doing that really stand out as important and crucial towards the meaning of the poem. You guys have done this already. You did it on the AP essay. What ended up happening is you guys had to talk about sleep or the king's state of mind, and you had to talk about diction, syntax, and imagery. You're doing basically the same thing, except you're doing it with a different poem, and you get to pick the devices, or you get to pick the things that the author is doing specifically to create the meaning. And I want to do this because it's analysis first off, and also it's going to push you into the AP essay mode, which I'm not trying to push you or teach you to the test here, but knowing how to do analysis is a huge part of the test, so this is a good practice or a good way to start. So read the poem, and you're going to pick a couple things that stand out to you. Now, if you guys look on the back side of this, you're going to notice that I have created a sample for you based on the poem we did yesterday, which was Wendy Mooney's Blackberry Picking. I'd like you guys to read this. You could read it to yourself, or you could read it aloud. You pick what you guys want to do. When you read it, I want you to highlight things that are worth mimicking or borrowing. Because this is a piece that I'm giving to you, I'm giving you some ideas of what you could borrow. You could treat it like a mentor text. And I want you to see what are some things that you could recreate or do that I've done. And that's perfectly acceptable. It's not plagiarism because I'm giving you permission. And then you're going to talk about what you guys noticed. So read through this, pick it apart, talk to each other. What do you notice? Because this is an A sample. This is what I want to see for you guys in order to score you well. So do that right now. So let me tell you what I'm noticing and making sure we both notice the same thing. If you look on the rubric, for a perfect 4, you're going to need to show critical analysis. You're going to discuss thoroughly the structure and meaning of the poem, and you're going to pick some thoughtful elements to discuss. And what I mean by thoughtful elements is they're important. They're not, I mean, I couldn't talk about, in this poem, you know, if I were to talk about, I can't even think of a bad example here, but if I'm talking about her poem, I'm not just going to talk about gender, or maybe I think gender is important. Actually, that could have been a good one. But maybe I want to talk about America. That's not a thoughtful element. That's not a thoughtful piece. Or if I wanted to talk about personification, I mean, is personification in there? That's not going to be a thoughtful or appropriate device or element to talk about. Now, the elements I picked are appropriate and thoughtful. Also, I tried to pick something that was kind of a little bit outside the box. Most of you guys, you know diction, you know syntax, but maybe you push it. Maybe you try a different technique that you're not very familiar with or you haven't tried before. And I think the techniques like dialogue, I thought that was a little bit outside of the box, so I thought that was thoughtful. So when you guys pick your elements, think, you know, you don't want to pick something that's so out there it doesn't make sense, but you want to think, you know, you could just do diction and tone. But those are, I mean, those are appropriate. They're definitely worth talking about, but maybe you push it a little bit more and you say, well, you know what, I noticed that, you know, she's using juxtaposition, or I noticed she's using characterization. So try to push outside your comfort zone to get the perfect day. You need to show a thoughtful, clear, and even a creative structure and organization. Now, if you notice how many paragraphs this is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you fall into a 5-paragraph essay, that's going to become cliche and you're going to score towards the C or D. You need to be careful that you don't fall into the 5-paragraph trap, which is one of the reasons why I did this 1-word paragraph. Now, you might not like it. You might say, I mean, it doesn't quite work because my first little paragraph's not really a paragraph, but do you see how I'm pushing the structure and I'm playing around with the idea of not just writing a traditional 5-paragraph essay? That's creative, or that's playing around with structure. Now, you don't have to worry about getting fancy with leads here. I don't need to get a fancy, you know, really florally lead. I just want you to get into the logistics of this poem and really pick it apart. And then always you should have good mechanics. Try grammar techniques like dashes and semicolons and simple sentences. So what I'm noticing here is I pick things that are a little bit different but still relevant. I used evidence. I used quoted evidence with my line numbers. I used good word choice. I actually tried a tone word, doleful, which is off of my list. You should try some tone vocab in this. Now, you don't want to get so tone vocab happy that it's like this entire thing reads like it's been thesaurused to death. You want to pick a couple good diction choices in your writing, but don't get so diction-y that it becomes too much. And I pick 3 things. Picking 3 things is not always gonna guarantee it's the best, but I thought there were 3 things that stood out. You might only find 2. And my last little tip here is maybe illusion's gonna be one of your techniques. I don't know, maybe, especially because we've been talking about it today. So if you have any questions about this, you should ask me. But this is 25 points. It's due tomorrow, and it should be a typed written response, and it should be double spaced, and it should have MLA format on it. So make sure you do MLA format, which we used to do over the summer. If you don't know what that is, you should Google it. If you don't know what it is or don't want to Google it, you should talk to me. So that's your homework. And I'm sorry that took a long time. Okay, your next activity is basically on the handout. You can read the directions to follow it, but you're going to read 2 poems. And you're going to pick them apart and you're going to talk about them. Now, I actually want you to read both poems together and then talk about it. Normally I would say read a poem, talk about it. Read the second poem, talk about it. I want you to read both poems at once, and it's not to overwhelm you. It's because on the AP test, sometimes on the poetry prompt, they'll give you 2 poems instead of 1. And so it becomes a curveball, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to annotate and figure out 2 poems. And so I want you guys to realize that sometimes it's not as easy as read this poem, annotate it, talk about it, read this poem, annotate it, and talk about it. Sometimes you have to think about 2 poems at the same time. And it can be a little confusing, but I want you guys to realize how you can intellectually multitask. So I want you to read the 2 poems on your own, pick them apart. They're both about Icarus. When you get done picking them apart, I want you to read them aloud, sentence to sentence, to each other. When you get done doing that, then I need you to voice record and tell me what you guys thought about the 2 poems, what were the messages of the 2 poems, as well as the 2 questions on the back, which I think are about syntax and how do they differ in theme. And then, when you get done, you'll watch the rest of the video and I'll explain what I noticed. So go. Okay, you just got done talking about these 2 poems. So here's some things I hope you got out of them. Both poems, I mean, they're both poems that have illusion in it, and they're both referencing this Icarus painting, but how they reference it is very different. If you notice Auden, what he ends up doing, his poem is really chunky and lengthy and very much about some intense syntax. I think he's arguing by the end of this piece that people they actively choose to ignore things that happen in life, and I think in many ways he doesn't think that's a good thing. Sometimes he argues that it's a part of life. Like, for instance, he talks about you have children who did not especially want to see it happen. They were skating on the edge of the woods or skating on a pond. Like, for instance, there are things that happen in this world, really bad things that kids don't understand. Like when 9/11 happened, and if you're a 5-year-old, you probably didn't know what that was necessarily. There are times where things get ignored because you're a child and your concept of the world is very skewed. So I think he's arguing that there are times like that, especially when he says about suffering they were never wrong. The old masters, how well they understood it's human position for us to want to note suffering or to react to suffering, but it's also our human position sometimes to choose to ignore it, and I think that's kind of what he's arguing, or he's pointing out, and I think he's kind of pointing that out and saying, you know what, maybe this is not something that's very good. Because when Icarus falls, you have 2 people who know and see it, but they choose not to do anything about it. You have the ship that sails calmly by. I mean, doesn't seem to really care that Icarus is drowning, doesn't try to stop or save him. You also have somebody, a plowman, who hears a splash, the forsaken cry, and the fact that he uses forsaken cry, I think, illustrates how much suffering or devastation this is, and yet the plowman ignores it. Everybody ignores it. They choose to ignore it. It's not that they're ignorant to it. It's not that they don't know it's happened. They actively choose to turn away and ignore it. And I think he's arguing about that issue and how it's wrong. And yeah, there are instances, he kind of, I mean, this reads like an essay a little bit, which is maybe why his syntax is so long and intense, because he's trying to articulate a very intense theme and idea. So that's what I got from Auden. Now, Williams is completely on the other spectrum here. Instead of talking about people being proactively choosing to ignore things around them, he is arguing that this guy just flat out nobody heard or saw it, basically. It's not that they were choosing to ignore it, it's just they didn't see or hear it. So you have this farmer who's plowing his field. It's in the middle of spring, which I think is really ironic, because if you guys remember Foster, spring is the time of new life, and yet here you have a guy dying. And you have the sun is melting the wings, so you have, this thing back to the mythology of it. Unsignificantly, off the coast. Unsignificantly. That word choice seems very, very important here. Unlike forsaken cry. Unsignificantly. It doesn't matter. The splash was quite unnoticed. Icarus was drowning. It's just kind of, nobody saw it, so, yeah. I mean, it's okay nobody saw it, because it's not that they chose to turn their head away from it, they just didn't see it. And I think the syntax here is very short. First, Williams does very short syntax, if you've ever read his stuff, but I think it's just arguing straight to the point, and it's simple because people want to say, well, why didn't you do anything? Well, if you don't know what's happening, how can you do something? How could they have saved Icarus when the fact of the matter is they just didn't see it? So that's what I got out of those 2 poems. What I want you to do to exit is in your blue books, I'd like you to tell me something about illusion. It could be a question, a comment, a connection. You might have relearned illusion, or you might argue why the illusion in these two pieces is interesting. But some type of comment towards illusion to exit for today, and remember your graded response. You guys are done.